At my own wedding reception, I caught the reflection of my older sister slipping a heavy dose of crushed pills into my champagne glass. I did not panic. I simply waited for her to turn around and quietly swapped our glasses. When she raised her glass to deliver a humiliating toast, smirking about a special surprise she had planned for me, I just smiled and took a sip. 20 minutes later, her surprise arrived, but it hit the completely wrong target. I am Gwendolyn, 26 years old, and my family has always treated me like a failure they had to hide. Before I reveal exactly how my sister's malicious wedding day prank unraveled her entire elite life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who constantly prayed for your downfall. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Azure Resort cast a warm golden glow over 200 of the most elite guests in the state. My husband Liam and I sat at the center of the sweetheart table, surrounded by an ocean of white roses and flowing champagne. From the outside, it looked like the perfect joining of families. But the reality was that my parents, William and Catherine, only invited their high society friends to show off my brother-in-law, Elijah. Elijah was a highly prominent African-American hedge fund manager whose flashy lifestyle fueled my parents' desperate delusions of grandeur. Liam and I were treated like background characters at our very own wedding. The clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low hum of conversation. My older sister Caroline stood up, smoothing down a custom silk gown that probably cost more than the entire catering budget. She walked to the microphone with the confident, arrogant stride she had perfected since childhood. "Good evening, everyone," Caroline announced, her voice echoing off the marble walls. As the older and, let us be honest, the more responsible sister, I always worried about our little Gwendolyn. She was always our quirky family dropout. When she quit her university degree to play around with numbers and spreadsheets, my parents and I lost so much sleep. We never thought she would find a man willing to put up with her stubbornness. But then Liam came along. Polite, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd of politicians and investment bankers. I felt Liam tense beside me. His hand, warm and steady, gripped mine under the table. I squeezed back, keeping my expression perfectly pleasant. I knew exactly what Caroline was doing. She needed to assert her dominance to remind the room that I was the scapegoat, the college dropout who could never measure up to her flawless image. I knew this was her ultimate revenge for me simply existing and daring to be happy. My family hated that I survived their constant emotional neglect. They wanted me destitute and entirely dependent on their pity. But today is a day of miracles, Caroline continued, her eyes locking onto mine with a predatory gleam. So let us raise a glass to the bride and groom. Congratulations, little sister. Drink up. I have a very special surprise planned for you, and it is coming soon. She raised the flute of champagne I had meticulously positioned at her place setting. I picked up the glass she had originally meant for me. I maintained eye contact with her, offering a sweet, unbothered smile, and took a long sip. Caroline smirked, clearly anticipating my imminent collapse. She drained her glass completely unaware that she had just swallowed the massive dose of sedatives she had intended for me. I set my glass down and turned my attention to my father. William took the microphone next, launching into a long-winded speech about his own business accomplishments, barely mentioning my marriage. I watched the clock on the far wall. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. By the 15-minute mark, I noticed Caroline shifting uncomfortably in her seat beside Elijah. She was wiping sweat from her forehead, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. Elijah, busy showing off his expensive watch to a nearby senator, completely ignored his wife. At exactly the 20-minute mark, the heavy sedatives took full effect. William was right in the middle of boasting about his latest real estate acquisition when a loud, disruptive groan erupted from the head table. Caroline stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward onto the polished floor. Her eyes were glazed over, rolling back slightly in her head. "Caroline, sit down!" "My mother," Catherine hissed, grabbing at her daughter's dress. "You are embarrassing us." But Caroline could not hear her. Her motor skills were completely failing. She swayed violently, letting out a garbled, slurred noise that echoed through the silent ballroom. The entire room of 200 guests stared in absolute shock. Elijah finally noticed and reached out, but he was too late. Caroline took one unsteady step forward. Her designer stiletto caught on the hem of her silk gown. She pitched forward like a felled tree, arms flailing uselessly at her sides. She crashed face first into the magnificent 5-tier wedding cake we had specifically ordered from Europe. The heavy wooden table buckled under her weight. Screams erupted from the front row as the entire structure collapsed. Caroline rolled onto the dance floor, her hair and face completely plastered in thick blue fondant and crushed vanilla cake. The violent impact mixed with the heavy narcotics triggered a severe physical reaction. Right there in front of her high society friends, her elite in-laws, and the flashing cameras of the wedding photographer Caroline began violently vomiting blue frosting and champagne all over the pristine white dance floor. She thrashed uncontrollably, screaming incoherent, terrified noises, slipping and sliding in her own mess. The glamorous, perfect golden child of the family was currently reduced to a feral, thrashing spectacle. Waiters rushed forward with napkins, guests jumped out of their seats in horror, and Elijah backed away in sheer disgust, refusing to even touch his wife. I remained seated, my posture perfect, my hands neatly folded in my lap. I did not scream. I did not rush to help her. I simply watched the chaos unfold exactly as she had planned it for me. But my mother did not look at Caroline. Catherine turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto me. Her face contorted with a rage so visceral it made the veins in her neck bulge. She abandoned her disgraced daughter on the floor and charged directly at the sweetheart table, her hand raised high, aiming a furious strike right at my face. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through the ballroom. My mother had done it. Catherine's palm collided with my cheek so hard my head snapped to the side. The remaining murmurs vanished instantly, replaced by a deafening, suffocated silence. My skin burned with a fierce heat, but I did not shed a tear. I slowly turned back to face her. Catherine stood there, chest heaving, her eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of panic and absolute malice. "You vindictive little freak!" she screamed, her voice shrill enough to rattle the crystal centerpieces on our table. "Look at what you did to your sister. You poisoned her. You planned this because you are rotting from the inside out with jealousy." I stared at her, my expression completely flat. Liam started to rise from his seat, his protective instincts flaring, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I needed to handle this myself. I needed my mother to dig her own grave in front of every elite guest she had spent the last 2 decades trying to impress. Jealous? I asked, my voice dangerously calm and carrying perfectly across the silent room. Why on earth would I be jealous of Caroline? Catherine let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark. Because she has everything you could never achieve. Because she married Elijah, a highly successful, wealthy hedge fund manager who actually provides for her. And what are you? You are nothing but a low-level bookkeeper who had to settle for a glorified IT guy. You could not stand watching your sister shine today. You knew she looked better, you knew her marriage was better, and you knew she is the daughter we actually respect. You dropped out of college, Gwendolyn. You are a failure, and you just could not let her have her perfect moment. She raised her hand again, curling her fingers inward, preparing to deliver a second, much harder strike to my other cheek. But this time I was completely ready. Before her hand could even begin its descent, I reached out and caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was like a steel vise. Catherine gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She tried to yank her arm away, but I held her firmly in place, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. The polite, quiet daughter she had bullied for 26 years was dead. Jealous. I repeated, my voice rising just enough to ensure every politician, banker, and socialite in the back rows could hear every single syllable. Like how you were so jealous of my future that you walked into the bank on my 18th birthday and drained my entire college fund. Catherine froze. Her face drained of all color, shifting from an angry crimson to a sickly, chalky white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I stepped out from behind the sweetheart table, never releasing her wrist, pulling her slightly forward so she had nowhere to hide. $60,000, Mom. Every penny my grandfather left me for my education gone in a single afternoon. And what did you do with it? Did you invest it? Did you save the family home from foreclosure? No. You used it to pay off Caroline's maxed out credit cards because she decided she needed a luxury European vacation and a closet full of designer bags she could not afford. You are lying! Catherine stammered, her voice shaking violently. Her eyes darted frantically toward her wealthy friends, who were now staring at her with unabashed disgust. Stop making up these insane stories. I am not making up anything, I stated, dropping her wrist as if touching her disgusted me. You stole my future to fund her fake lifestyle. You stood in our kitchen and told me that Caroline needed the financial boost because she was destined for high society, while I was only fit for community college. You forced me to drop out because I could not pay my tuition. And then you had the absolute audacity to spend the next 8 years telling all your friends that I was a lazy, unmotivated dropout who could not handle the academic pressure. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I saw several of my parents' most prominent friends exchanging horrified whispers. The flawless, wealthy facade my mother had meticulously curated over decades was crumbling into dust right before her eyes. The truth was out ugly and undeniable. She had sacrificed one daughter to finance the delusions of the other. You are a monster, Catherine whispered, her chest heaving as she backed away from me. You planned this whole spectacle just to humiliate us. You do not care about family. You do not care about loyalty. Loyalty is a two-way street. Catherine, I replied coldly. You chose your favorite. You chose the daughter who lies, cheats, and currently smells like cheap champagne and stomach acid on the dance floor. I chose myself. I chose to build a life where I never had to rely on your conditional affection ever again. Catherine looked around the room, realizing she was losing control of the narrative. Her friends were not rushing to comfort her. They were judging her. Her husband William was still paralyzed near the fallen cake, unable to comprehend the disaster unfolding around him. The elite status she craved so desperately was evaporating. Cornered animals fight the hardest, and my mother was entirely cornered. She puffed out her chest, summoning the last ounce of her false authority, and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. You are done, she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings. You are completely done, Gwendolyn. I am putting an end to this pathetic charade right now. I am calling the resort manager this very second. I paid the deposit for this venue, and I am canceling this wedding immediately. Get your trashy husband and get out. Manager, get over here this instant, Catherine screamed, waving her arms wildly toward the perimeter of the ballroom. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a tailored suit stepped forward from the shadows near the kitchen entrance. It was Marcus, the general manager of the Grand Azure Resort. He walked toward the sweetheart table with a perfectly calm and measured pace, his face completely devoid of the panic my mother clearly expected him to exhibit. Security! Catherine barked, pointing a shaking finger at Liam and me. I want these two removed from the premises immediately. They are trespassing. And I want my $20,000 deposit refunded to my card by the end of the hour. This event is officially canceled. My daughter has been poisoned, and I will be holding this venue personally liable if you do not drag them out of here right now. The ballroom fell so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. The elite guests, the politicians, the bankers my parents worshipped all watched with bated breath. I saw the mayor's wife whispering frantically to a state senator in the front row. Marcus stopped a few feet away from my mother. He did not signal for security. He did not apologize. Instead, he looked at Catherine with an expression of profound, unfiltered pity. He slowly raised the digital tablet he was holding. Ma'am, I am afraid I cannot do that. Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute professional authority. First of all, your $20,000 deposit was never processed. Your credit card was declined for insufficient funds exactly 6 weeks ago. A collective gasp swept through the room. Catherine's face went completely slack. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion of her limitless wealth had just been publicly shattered. That is impossible, my father! William suddenly bellowed, stepping away from the ruined cake where Caroline was still groaning on the floor. "There must be a mistake with your billing department. We are VIP clients. We have millions in assets. Run the card again." "There is no mistake," Sir Marcus replied evenly, not breaking eye contact with my mother. "When your card declined, we contacted the bride directly. Gwendolyn stepped in and paid the entire $150,000 balance for this wedding in full. She paid via direct wire transfer that same afternoon. She even covered the premium upgrades for the imported truffles and the live orchestra that you specifically demanded." William froze. He looked at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. He blinked rapidly, his brain completely failing to process the numbers Marcus had just spoken out loud. "That makes absolutely no sense." William stammered, his voice rising in panic as he looked around at his peers. "Gwendolyn is a basic accounting clerk. She does not have that kind of money. She makes $45,000 a year at some strip mall tax firm. I know exactly what she makes because I looked at her tax returns 8 years ago when she dropped out of school. She is broke." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was almost sad how little they knew about me. 8 years, Dad. You have not asked me a single question about my career in 8 years. You were so busy throwing extravagant parties to celebrate Caroline marrying a hedge fund manager that you never once bothered to ask what your youngest daughter actually did for a living. You assumed I was destitute because it fit your perfect narrative. Before William could form a coherent response, Marcus cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention once more. Furthermore, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling Marcus continued, his tone dropping an octave. "Gwendolyn did not just pay for the catering and the floral arrangements. Last month, Gwendolyn's private holding company officially purchased the Grand Azure Resort. She is my employer. She owns this entire estate. Therefore, you are currently standing on her private property. If anyone is going to be escorted out by security tonight, it will be you the moment she gives me the signal." The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Catherine looked physically ill. She grabbed the edge of a nearby dining table to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. The realization that she was standing in a building owned by the daughter she had spent years calling a worthless failure was short-circuiting her mind. She looked at her wealthy friends in the crowd, desperately searching for a lifeline, but they were all staring back at her with undisguised judgment. The golden facade of the Sterling family was permanently destroyed. William's face turned a violent shade of purple. The shock morphed instantly into explosive, uncontrollable rage. He marched toward me, kicking aside a piece of broken cake stand that lay in his path. Liam immediately stepped in front of me, his shoulders squared physically, blocking my father from getting any closer. "You stole this money!" William roared, spit flying from his lips. "There is no other explanation. You are a thief and a psychopath. You stole millions of dollars and then you bought this place just to humiliate us. And you drugged your own sister out of pure spite. You are going to prison for this. I am calling the police right now." William furiously patted down his tuxedo pockets, frantically searching for his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the fabric of his jacket. I stayed perfectly still behind Liam. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, reached into my own bridal clutch, and pulled out my phone. "There is no need to call them Dad," I said, my voice echoing crisply into the microphone I had picked up from the sweetheart table. "I already did. They are on their way. And while we wait for the authorities to arrive and arrest the actual criminals in this room, let me show you exactly what Caroline drank tonight." I kept the microphone in one hand and used my other to plug my phone directly into the auxiliary cord resting on the edge of our sweetheart table. Our DJ had specifically set it up for me earlier in the evening. I tapped the screen twice. The upbeat ambient music cut out instantly. A heavy static filled the ballroom, followed by the crisp, unmistakable sound of a door clicking shut. My husband Liam stepped up beside me. He slipped his arm around my waist, projecting an aura of absolute calm. When Caroline had insisted on visiting my bridal suite alone this morning to drop off a supposedly sentimental gift, Liam immediately knew something was wrong. My sister had not given me a gift in 10 years. Liam makes his living as a high-level cybersecurity architect. Accessing the resort's internal security feeds Took him less than 3 minutes. We watched her tamper with my champagne glass in real time. We also listened to the conversation she had with my mother immediately afterward in the adjoining hallway. My mother's voice suddenly boomed through the massive surround sound speakers of the ballroom. "Is it done?" The recording was crystal clear. Caroline's voice echoed back, laced with a giddy, breathless excitement. "I put the heavy sedatives in her glass. I used the entire vial, just like you said. When Gwen starts seizing and acting completely crazy at the reception, we call the ambulance immediately. We make a huge scene so everyone sees how unstable she is. Do you have the psychiatric paperwork ready?" The audio captured the sound of paper shuffling. Catherine's recorded voice replied cold and calculating. "Your father has the medical power of attorney forms in his jacket. We will have her committed for a severe psychotic break. The judge is a friend of your father's. We will get her under a full conservatorship by Monday morning. Once she is declared legally incompetent, your father gets full control of her business bank accounts. We can liquidate her assets and finally fix our own financial mess. Nobody is going to believe a hysterical college dropout over her own loving parents." I tapped my screen, pausing the audio. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of a betrayal so grotesque it defied logic. I looked at my mother. She was shaking her hands, covering her mouth, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered rat. My father had gone completely rigid. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and aged. "You did not just want to ruin my wedding day," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone. "You wanted to erase my entire life. You ran a background check on me, did you not, Dad? You hired that private investigator last month because you could not figure out how Liam and I were suddenly buying property. You thought I was just a lowly clerk, but then you saw the tax filings. You saw the multi-million-dollar corporate accounts attached to my holding company. You realized the daughter you discarded had quietly built an empire while you were drowning in debt trying to keep up with Caroline's lavish lifestyle." William opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, but he just sputtered uselessly, gripping the back of a chair to keep himself upright. "So you hatched a brilliant plan." I continued, taking a step closer to the edge of the stage. "You decided to drug me in front of 200 witnesses. You wanted to manufacture a public psychiatric emergency. You were going to use the exact same legal loophole that trapped Britney Spears. Lock the crazy daughter in a facility, slap a conservatorship on her, and legally steal every single penny I bled to earn. You were going to strip me of my human rights, lock me in a padded room, and steal my company just to pay off your mortgages." The guests were no longer just whispering. Angry murmurs and gasps of horror rippled through the crowd. The politicians my father had spent months courting were actively turning their backs, signaling their staff to leave. The sheer depravity of a mother and father conspiring to drug and institutionalize their own child for a paycheck was too toxic for even the most cynical socialites to stomach. "You are twisting this!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed frantically at the speakers. "That audio is doctored. Liam is a computer hacker. He faked our voices using artificial intelligence. He manipulated the recording to frame us. We just wanted to get you help. You have always been unstable, Gwendolyn. You need serious psychiatric intervention." I shook my head, marveling at her absolute refusal to accept reality. "You are incredibly predictable, Catherine. I knew you would claim the audio was fake. That is exactly why Liam forwarded the raw, unedited security footage directly to the local police department 20 minutes ago. They have the time-stamped video of Caroline pouring the sedatives into my glass. They have the audio. And they have the glass itself, which I secured in an evidence bag the moment I swapped our drinks." Catherine let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. Caroline was still on the floor, groaning incoherently, utterly oblivious to the fact that her own mother and father were about to be indicted for a federal crime. William looked like he was about to pass out, his chest heaving as he realized his entire legacy was turning to ash. I had won. I had exposed them, protected my assets, and completely dismantled their narrative. But then the crowd parted. Elijah, Caroline's husband, stepped forward from the shadows near the bar. He slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket, his face an impenetrable mask of pure arrogance. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking completely unfazed by the fact that his wife was rolling in cake frosting, and his in-laws had just been exposed as criminal masterminds. He walked right up to the front of the room, clapping his hands together in a slow, mocking rhythm. "Cute recording, Gwendolyn." Elijah sneered, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "Really top-tier theatrics. It almost makes up for the cheap catering. But here's the problem with your little revenge fantasy. Illegal wiretaps and unauthorized surveillance recordings are completely inadmissible in court. Any halfway decent lawyer will have that audio thrown out before the judge even strikes the gavel." Elijah stopped at the edge of the dance floor, looking down at Liam with a chilling, predatory grin. "And you really have no idea who you are messing with." Elijah closed the remaining distance between him and my husband. He was a tall, imposing man who used his physical presence just as effectively as his checkbook to bully people into submission. He loomed over Liam, invading his personal space, deliberately flashing a platinum watch that cost more than most people made in a decade. "Listen to me very carefully, you little computer nerd," Elijah said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You think you are playing some kind of high-level chess game here because you managed to hack a hotel security camera. You think you are clever, but you are out of your depth. You are playing in a league you do not even understand." Liam did not step back. He stood his ground, his eyes locked dead onto Elijah's, completely unbothered by the intimidation tactic. Elijah scoffed, turning his attention to the crowd before snapping his gaze back to us. "Let me explain how the real world works to you two. William and Catherine know how it works. That is why they worship me. They know I am the golden ticket. They know my hedge fund manages billions. They know I hold the keys to the rooms they have spent their entire pathetic lives trying to sneak into. They happily threw you to the wolves, Gwendolyn, because you are dead weight. You bring nothing to the table. You embarrass them by existing. I elevated them. I am the son-in-law they actually wanted. And you, Liam, you are just the joke they had to tolerate at holiday dinners. A low-level tech drone scraping by on a salary I drop on a single weekend in Monaco." Catherine, who had been cowering behind a chair just moments ago, suddenly straightened her posture. Elijah's aggressive intervention breathed new life into her lungs. The panic vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by the same vicious, arrogant glare she had worn my entire life. She smoothed down the front of her ruined silk dress and stepped up to stand right beside her wealthy son-in-law, practically vibrating with renewed confidence. "You tell them, Elijah." Catherine spat, her voice regaining its shrill, commanding edge. "These two have always been nothing but jealous, spiteful parasites. They have been plotting this out of pure envy because they know they will never achieve a fraction of what you and Caroline have." Elijah raised his hand, silencing my mother with a single dismissive gesture. He did not even look at her. He kept his predatory gaze fixed squarely on Liam. "I do not like pests interfering with my family." Elijah continued his tone, dropping to a dangerous, quiet rumble. "So when my wife told me this morning that she was worried about what you two might pull at the reception, I made a few phone calls. I have a lot of resources, Liam. I had my associates look into that little cybersecurity firm you work for. You know, the one you are so proud of, the one that pays your meaningless little bills." Elijah paused, letting a cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "It turns out my hedge fund just executed a hostile takeover of your parent company last quarter. We own a controlling stake in the firm that signs your paychecks. Or rather, the firm that used to sign your paychecks." A murmur rippled through the few guests who had not yet fled the ballroom. My father, William, suddenly perked up from where he was standing near the collapsed wedding cake. A sickening look of relief washed over his face as he realized Elijah was stepping in to crush us. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from the mess on the dance floor. "I made one single phone call yesterday afternoon," Liam Elijah boasted, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are fired. As of yesterday at 5 o'clock, you are officially unemployed." But I did not stop there. I personally ensured that you are completely blacklisted across the entire tech sector. I froze your severance. I voided your stock options. I made sure that no reputable firm in this country will ever hire you to fix a jammed printer, let alone manage their network security. Elijah took a step back, opening his arms wide, gesturing to the lavish, ruined ballroom around us. So let us review the facts, he announced. Your audio recording means absolutely nothing because I will have it suppressed. You are both entirely unemployed. You are broke, nobody's trying to play a high-stakes game against a billionaire. I will tie you up in civil litigation until you cannot even afford to feed yourselves. I will bankrupt you. I will crush you both so thoroughly, you will wish you had just let Caroline have her fun. Apologize to my wife and my in-laws right now, or I will end you. Catherine clapped her hands together, letting out a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter. You heard him, Catherine yelled, stepping forward to point her finger directly at my face. You are finished, Gwendolyn. Your little stunt is over. You have no money, your husband is a blacklisted failure, and you are going to pay for every single cent of damage you caused tonight. Now get on your knees. Get on your knees right now and beg for mercy. Apologize to us in front of everyone, or we will destroy whatever pathetic remnants of a life you have left. The ballroom was dead silent. Elijah stood there radiating supreme confidence, waiting for us to shatter. Catherine was practically panting with anticipation, eager to watch me crawl. Liam did not flinch. He did not look angry. He did not look scared. Instead, Liam began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a full hysterical laugh that echoed off the marble columns of the ballroom. Elijah's smug smile faltered. Catherine took an uncertain step backward, entirely unnerved by Liam's reaction. Liam shook his head, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and slowly pulled out a sleek, heavy metal pen. He twirled it casually between his fingers, looking at Elijah with an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. Fired, Liam, asked, his voice dripping with a dangerous kind of humor. You fired me. Elijah, did you even bother to read the urgent emails your firm received on Friday afternoon? Elijah's confident sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, puffing out his chest, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. You are bluffing, Elijah snapped, though his eyes were darting rapidly across his inbox. I own your company. I own you. You really do not pay attention to the details, do you? Liam asked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. You see, Elijah, you never bothered to do proper due diligence. You just saw a profitable cybersecurity firm, threw your hedge fund's money at it, and assumed you were buying the keys to the kingdom. But you could not fire me. Do you know why? Because on Friday morning, exactly at 9 o'clock, I sold that firm to the United States Department of Defense for $80 million. A sharp gasp rippled through the remaining crowd. My mother's jaw practically unhinged, her eyes darting between Liam and Elijah in sheer panic. That is impossible, Elijah barked, jabbing his finger at his phone screen. My fund executed a hostile takeover last quarter. I hold the controlling stake. I own 51% of your shares. You own 51% of a ghost? Liam corrected, his smile widening into a predatory grin of his own. When you initiated your little hostile takeover, my partners and I saw you coming from a mile away. We knew your hedge fund operated through a labyrinth of shell corporations, so we set a trap. We structured a dummy corporation. We legally transferred all the meaningless administrative liabilities into that specific shell. That is the entity you bought, Elijah. You spent millions of dollars acquiring an empty husk. Elijah was furiously tapping his phone, now his face draining of its arrogant color. The screen cast a pale, sickly glow across his features. But what about the intellectual property? Elijah stammered, his voice rising in pitch, losing all of its smooth, practiced charm. The patents, the government contracts. I own those. Wrong again, Liam said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. He was no longer the quiet, polite son-in-law my parents had dismissed. He was a shark who had just cornered his prey. The proprietary defense algorithms, the active government contracts, and the actual assets were secured under a completely separate, heavily encrypted holding company. The moment your shell corporation attempted to absorb our assets on Friday, it triggered an automatic poison pill clause mandated by our federal contracts. The Department of Defense immediately acquired the real company for $80 million. Simultaneously, the federal regulators liquidated your shell corporation for compliance violations. Elijah's hands began to shake. He tapped his screen harder, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. Elijah gasped, staring at his phone. My executive portals, they are down. Everything is locked. Of course they are locked, Liam replied smoothly. Your hedge fund's board of directors realized what you did on Friday afternoon. You dumped tens of millions of their investors' capital into a completely voided, liquidated asset. You created a massive financial black hole. They did not just lock you out of your portals, Elijah. They convened an emergency board meeting. You are the one who is fired. You are the one who is blacklisted. By Monday morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission will be knocking on your door to ask exactly how you managed to vaporize your clients' retirement funds. The transition was spectacular to witness. The untouchable, arrogant billionaire was currently unraveling into a terrified, hyperventilating mess. Elijah dropped his phone. It clattered against the polished marble floor, the screen cracking straight down the middle. He stared at his trembling hands, entirely unable to comprehend the magnitude of his ruin. He had tried to crush my husband out of pure spite, and in doing so he had walked blindly into an $80 million trap. My father let out a pathetic wheezing sound. William leaned heavily against a dining chair, his legs visibly shaking. The golden ticket he had worshipped, the wealthy son-in-law he had used to elevate his social status, was now a disgraced, unemployed fraud facing federal investigation. Catherine was completely hyperventilating. She looked down at Caroline, who was still moaning softly on the dance floor, covered in sticky blue fondant and entirely useless. Then Catherine looked at Elijah, who was pulling at his expensive silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. All of her schemes, all of her manipulation, all of her desperate attempts to secure her elite lifestyle had just imploded. This cannot be happening, Catherine whimpered, her voice frail and completely devoid of its previous malice. Elijah, tell them they are lying. Tell them you still have your money. Tell me my daughter did not marry a failure. Elijah did not answer her. He could not even look at her. He was too busy staring at Liam with an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. The power dynamic in the room had permanently flipped. We were no longer the victims trapped in their web of abuse. We were the executioners. I decided it was time to deliver the final, fatal blow. I stepped out from behind Liam. The heavy silk of my wedding dress brushed softly against the floor as I walked over to the nearest untouched dining table. I reached down into the large leather tote bag I had hidden beneath the table earlier that evening. I pulled out a massive, heavily bound binder. It was 5 inches thick, packed tightly with printed spreadsheets, bank statements, and highlighted financial records. I lifted the binder high and dropped it onto the glass tabletop. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Everyone jumped. Liam handles the cybersecurity, I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the ruined reception, cutting through Elijah's panicked breathing and my mother's quiet sobs. But I handle the money. I placed my hands flat on top of the binder, leaning forward to lock eyes with Elijah. He flinched, shrinking back from me as if I were holding a weapon. You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else? I continued, my tone dripping with absolute authority. You all thought I was just a basic bookkeeper, a low-level clerk pushing papers for minimum wage. You thought you could run your dirty money, commit wire fraud, and hide your embezzlement without anyone ever noticing. I tapped the thick cover of the binder with my index finger. Elijah, I asked, tilting my head slightly with a razor-sharp smile. Do you know what a forensic accountant is? Elijah stared at me, his jaw slightly slack, the confident smirk completely wiped from his face. He blinked rapidly, clearly, struggling to comprehend the sudden shift in gravity. I did not give him a chance to recover. I leaned over the table, my voice ringing out with an icy clarity that commanded the attention of every single person left in the ballroom. It means I track dirty money, Elijah. It means I hunt down ghosts. For the past 8 years, while my parents thought I was rotting away in a bleak cubicle doing basic tax returns, I was building my own firm. I do not file personal taxes. My firm is contracted by the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission to unravel complex financial fraud. I track offshore accounts, phantom transactions, and corporate embezzlement. I built a multi-million-dollar agency specifically designed to find the exact kind of rot that people like you try to bury. I reached out and grabbed the thick cover of the binder, flipping it open to the first tab. A massive, complex flowchart was printed across a fold-out page detailing hundreds of shell companies' dummy accounts and wire transfers. I looked up at Elijah, whose arrogance was rapidly melting into physical sickness. A sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. "Your hedge fund is a complete and utter joke, Elijah," I announced, making sure my voice carried to the back rows where several prominent investors were currently standing. "You are not investing your clients' money. You are not a financial genius. You have not made a single legitimate profitable market trade in over 3 years. You have been running a textbook Ponzi scheme." A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. I saw two men in expensive suits physically stumble backward, pulling out their phones in sheer panic. They were clearly investors in his fund. "You take capital from new investors and you use it to pay fake dividends to the old ones." I continued my finger tapping against the flowchart. "You create fraudulent quarterly reports to keep the illusion alive, masking the fact that your core accounts are completely hollow. But more importantly, you have been using fresh investor capital as your own personal piggy bank to fund Caroline's ridiculous shopping addiction and your own lavish lifestyle." "That is a lie," Elijah shouted, though his voice cracked humiliatingly on the last word. He took a step toward the table, but Liam immediately shifted his stance, blocking him with a look that dared him to try it. "These are fabricated documents. You hacked my servers and falsified the data." I smiled, turning to the next section of the binder. "Let us look at last summer," I said, ignoring his desperate protests. "You secured a $2 million deposit from a real estate developer in Chicago. 3 days later, $100,000 of that exact deposit was wired to a shell company in Cyprus. That shell company immediately paid for a luxury yacht rental in Monaco." I lifted my gaze from the page and looked directly at my mother. Catherine was trembling violently, her eyes wide with mounting horror. "Do you remember Monaco, Mom?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Do you remember posting all those pictures with Caroline on the deck of that yacht? Do you remember bragging to your entire country club about how your golden child and her brilliant husband treated you to the vacation of a lifetime? You drank champagne bought with money stolen from a pensioner's retirement fund." Catherine let out a sharp, strangled noise, taking a stumbling step backward. She looked at Elijah, her eyes begging him to deny it, but Elijah was completely frozen, staring at the binder as if it were a live bomb. I turned another heavy page. $50,000 wired in November to a private jeweler in New York, I read aloud. It was for the diamond tennis bracelet Caroline wore to our family Thanksgiving dinner. The exact same dinner where you, Mom, told me I should ask my sister for fashion advice because my department store sweater was an embarrassment to the family aesthetic. The horrifying reality settled heavily over the room. The flawless, wealthy facade my mother had worshipped was entirely built on a criminal enterprise. My parents had spent years comparing me to Caroline, elevating her as the ultimate success story, treating her like royalty while treating me like dirt beneath their shoes. But Caroline had not earned their love or her status. She had bought it. She purchased their relentless favoritism using stolen funds from oblivious investors. She had funded the illusion of extreme wealth to create a narrative that made me look like an absolute failure by comparison. "You sold my college fund to pay for a daughter who was actively financing your lifestyle with felony wire fraud," I said, staring at my mother as tears of sheer panic finally spilled down her cheeks. "You treated me like a peasant because I actually earned my money legally." Elijah was panting now. He backed away from Liam, his hands running frantically over his head. "You cannot use this," he stammered, his eyes wild. "This is stolen data. It is inadmissible." "It does not matter if you think it is inadmissible here," I replied coolly, "because I did not just bring this binder to my wedding. I delivered a duplicate copy of this entire forensic audit to my contacts at the SEC and the FBI on Friday morning. They already have the transaction logs. They already have the offshore routing numbers. By the time you wake up on Monday, federal agents will be tearing your office apart. You are going to federal prison, Elijah, and your wife will likely be joining you as a co-conspirator. Elijah let out a guttural cry of defeat. He turned and shoved his way through the remaining guests, sprinting toward the exit doors, abandoning his comatose wife on the floor without a second thought. Nobody tried to stop him. They practically recoiled from him as he ran. I watched him flee, feeling an immense, powerful calm settle into my bones. Then I grabbed the thick stack of papers in the binder and flipped all the way to the very last page. It was a single, heavily redacted legal document with a few very specific, highly recognizable signatures at the bottom. I turned my attention away from the fleeing coward and locked eyes with my father. William was gripping the back of a chair, his face slick with cold sweat, looking like a man standing on the gallows. "Speaking of new investors," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute silence of the room. "William, care to tell the room what you did with the family estate last month?" The color drained from William's face so fast, he looked as though he had been physically drained of blood. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the back of the banquet chair with both hands just to stay upright. A low collective murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. Everyone in that ballroom knew about the family estate. It was the crown jewel of his manufactured prestige, a historic property that had been in our family for 4 generations. It was the very foundation of his entire social identity. I flipped to the final section of the binder and slid a crisp, heavily stamped document out of a plastic sleeve. I held it up for the room to see. "You did not think anyone would find out, did you, Dad?" I asked, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "You thought you were making a brilliant clandestine move. You took out a predatory, high-interest $5 million loan against the generational estate. You leveraged the only real asset this family had left to its absolute breaking point. And then you took every single penny of that loan and wired it directly into Elijah's hollow hedge fund." William opened his mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. Catherine turned to him, her eyes wide with a sudden, uncomprehending horror. "William," Catherine shrieked, grabbing his arm. "What is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. You did not touch the house." He pushed her hand away, his facade completely crumbling. He turned his panicked, wild eyes toward the back of the room where Elijah had just fled, but the doors were already swinging shut. The realization that he had been conned by his own favorite son-in-law hit him like a freight train. "He promised me," William screamed, his voice cracking violently. "He promised me a 30% guaranteed return by the end of the quarter." "You do not understand. I had to do it. The company margins were failing, the country club dues, the property taxes, Caroline's lavish lifestyle. We were drowning. Elijah said it was a foolproof bridge loan. He said he would double the $5 million in 3 months and save my reputation." I stared at him, feeling a deep, profound disgust. This was the man who had lectured me my entire life about financial responsibility. This was the man who called me a failure because I refused to buy designer clothes I could not afford. "You risked the safety of your entire family," I said, my tone cold and clinical. "You gambled 4 generations of history just so you could keep playing golf with the elite. You handed over $5 million to a man who has not made a legitimate market trade in 3 years, all because you were too greedy and too desperate to maintain an illusion of wealth. You sold our heritage for a phantom 30% return." Catherine let out a piercing wail, sinking to her knees right there on the polished marble floor. She clawed at the ruined fabric of her dress, finally grasping the absolute devastation of their reality. Her country club status, her lavish vacations, her historic home, all of it was gone. She looked at Caroline, who was still groggy and covered in cake, and for the first time in my life, I saw Catherine look at her golden child with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You fool!" Catherine screamed at my father, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You gave him our home. You gave that parasite our home." William ignored her. He stumbled forward, reaching a trembling hand toward the binder on the table. "Gwendolyn, He pleaded, his arrogant posture entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic slouch of a broken man. Please, you have to help me. You said you track these funds. You are a forensic accountant. You can get the money back. You have to trace the wire transfer and recover the 5 million before the bank forecloses. I looked down at the man who had just spent the last hour trying to drug me and commit me to a psychiatric ward so he could steal my business. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, just the cool, calculated detachment of a professional closing a file. I reached out and tapped the heavy cover of the binder. "That $5 million is gone, Dad," I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. "It never went into an investment portfolio. It never hit the stock market. The second your wire transfer cleared, Elijah routed the entire sum directly into Caroline's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were going to use your house money to flee the country the moment this Ponzi scheme collapsed." William's chest heaved. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. Caroline, who was finally starting to sit up, blinked in groggy confusion as her father turned his furious, devastated glare upon her. "But here is the real tragedy for you, William," I continued, my voice cutting through the rising chaos of the room. "Liam did not just hack the hotel security cameras tonight. He also accessed those offshore accounts. And this morning, while you were all getting dressed up to come ruin my life, Liam forwarded the routing data to the federal authorities. Those accounts are frozen. Every single penny is locked down by the federal government pending a criminal investigation." I closed the binder, the heavy thud echoing with a sense of ultimate finality. "You are officially bankrupt," I told him, holding his gaze until he looked away. "And by the end of the month, you will be officially homeless." Catherine sobbed louder, burying her face in her hands. William collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at the floor, his entire world entirely vaporized. The guests who had stayed to watch the spectacle were now rapidly backing away, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my parents' complete destruction. I turned to Liam, who stepped forward and gently placed his hand on the small of my back. The nightmare was over. The suffocating weight I had carried for my entire life was finally lifted. I had exposed their lies, protected my assets, and watched their toxic empire burn to the ground by their own hands. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable wail of police sirens pierced the night air, echoing loudly from the resort's main entrance. The red and blue emergency lights instantly began to strobe against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the resort ballroom. The chaotic flashes illuminated the sheer panic etched into every line of Elijah's face. The untouchable, arrogant titan of finance, a man who just minutes ago had been threatening to bankrupt my husband and crush my entire existence, shattered into a million pieces. The illusion of his absolute control evaporated the exact second the reality of a federal raid hit his ears. Elijah let out a guttural, panicked noise that sounded more like a cornered animal than a human being. He spun on his heel, his custom-tailored Italian leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished marble floor. He completely abandoned Catherine, who was still weeping, into her hands. He ignored William, who was slouched against a chair in a state of catatonic ruin. And he certainly did not spare a single glance for his heavily drugged wife lying in a pile of ruined cake. Elijah only cared about self-preservation. He lowered his head and sprinted directly toward the rear exit of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall led to a private valet alley, a discreet exit meant for VIP guests. Elijah threw his entire body weight against the brass push bars, fully expecting to burst out into the night and disappear before the authorities breached the lobby. A loud, dull thud echoed through the room as his body slammed against the unyielding wood. The doors did not budge an inch. Elijah grunted in pain, stumbling backward. He quickly recovered and launched himself at the doors again, his hands desperately rattling the heavy brass handles. He pulled, shoved, and kicked at the wood. Nothing happened. The electronic deadbolts were firmly and immovably engaged. He pounded his fists against the oak, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that amplified the absolute pathetic nature of his escape attempt. Liam stepped forward from the sweetheart table. He raised his left hand, holding up a small, sleek tablet. The screen glowed brightly in the dimming light of the ballroom, displaying lines of active code and a digital schematic of the resort's entire floor plan. A small pulsing red lock icon hovered right over the rear exit doors. "I told you," Elijah Liam called out, his voice cutting cleanly through the frantic rattling of the brass handles. "I handle the cybersecurity." Elijah froze, pressing his back flat against the locked doors as he stared at my husband in absolute horror. It turns out, Liam continued, his tone conversational and utterly unbothered, that a luxury resort with a fully integrated state-of-the-art smart lock security network is remarkably easy to partition if you understand system architecture. I locked down the perimeter of this specific ballroom exactly 12 minutes ago. The electronic overrides have been completely disabled. The only people opening those doors are the federal agents who are currently marching through the main lobby. Elijah began to hyperventilate. The paranoia was eating him alive, stripping away his suave exterior and leaving a sweating, terrified fraud in its wake. He looked away from Liam and turned his wild, bloodshot eyes toward the remaining guests. These were his peers. These were the politicians he bribed, the country club elites he golfed with, the high society socialites he and Caroline had spent years courting and manipulating. He stumbled away from the locked doors, practically tripping over his own feet as he moved toward a cluster of men in expensive tuxedos. The men immediately took a synchronized step backward, treating Elijah as if he were highly infectious. "Please," Elijah begged, holding his trembling hands out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "You have to help me. Charles, you have your private security detail waiting right outside. Call them. Tell them to breach the loading dock and get me to an unmarked car. Arthur, call the governor. Call the attorney general. We can fix this. It is just a minor compliance misunderstanding. I can make everyone whole. Just get me out of this room." Arthur, a prominent real estate mogul who was known for his ruthless business tactics, looked down at Elijah. Arthur had personally invested over $2 million into Elijah's hedge fund just last month. The horrifying realization that his capital had not been invested in emerging tech markets, but had instead paid for Caroline's Cartier jewelry and Monaco yacht rentals, was settling deeply into his features. Arthur did not reach for his phone. He did not signal his security team. He slowly adjusted his cuffs, stepped entirely out of Elijah's path, and stared at him with unadulterated, venomous disgust. "Do not speak to me," Arthur said, his voice laced with absolute revulsion. "Do not even look in my direction. You are a dead man walking." Elijah let out a strangled sob. He scrambled to the next group, his knees buckling until he was practically crawling on the marble floor. He wept ugly, gasping sobs that ruined his meticulously crafted facade. He begged a state senator who quickly turned his back. He pleaded with a local judge who actively walked away. He even begged the catering manager who was standing frozen near the swinging kitchen doors. No one moved to help him. The elite crowd, a group of people who usually protected their own wealth and status at all costs, recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. The financial rot was too deep, the federal implications too severe. Elijah was completely toxic, and they were watching him drown with grim, silent satisfaction. I watched him crawl on the floor, feeling an immense, powerful calm settle into my bones. This was the man my parents had chosen over me. This was the man they had allowed to insult my husband, mock my career, and attempt to hijack my wedding day. They had worshipped his bank accounts without ever once questioning where the money actually came from. Now the Grand Patriarch was entirely bankrupt, the elite mother was a public disgrace, and their billionaire savior was begging waiters for an escape route. The absolute poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. Then a low, wretched sound broke through Elijah's pathetic, gasping sobs. From the corner of the room, right near the shattered remains of our 4-tier wedding cake, a loud groan echoed across the floor. Everyone turned. Caroline was beginning to stir. The heavy sedatives Catherine had instructed her to pour into my champagne glass were finally starting to wear off. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her movements incredibly sluggish and uncoordinated. Her expensive designer gown was completely ruined, smeared with thick blue frosting, and smelling strongly of the vomit she had expelled earlier in the evening. She blinked rapidly, her false eyelashes peeling off her eyelids, looking completely disoriented, as the red and blue police lights continued to aggressively flash across the ballroom walls. She rubbed her face, smearing blue dye across her cheek, and looked up at the circle of horrified guests staring down at her. "Why is my head spinning?" Caroline slurred her words thick and heavy. Caroline blinked, her drug-laced brain struggling to process the flashing police lights illuminating the ballroom. She planted her hands on the marble floor, attempting to push herself up, but her palms found only smeared blue frosting and vomit. Her arms gave out. She slipped, landing hard on her side, with a wet, heavy slap that made several guests physically recoil. She groaned, finally managing to drag herself up onto her knees. Her designer gown was a ruined, sticky mess. Her perfect hair hung in matted clumps against her pale face. She looked like a complete monster emerging from a swamp of sugar and bile. She scanned the room, her eyes darting past the horrified expressions of the elite guests, past our mother sobbing on the floor, and past our father staring blankly into the void. Her gaze finally locked onto me. Liam and I stood tall behind the sweetheart table, completely untouched by the chaos. Then she looked toward the back of the room, finding her husband pressing his sweating, trembling body against the locked oak doors. Caroline did not comprehend the gravity of the situation. Her mind, heavily fogged by the very sedatives she had intended for me, bypassed all logic and immediately defaulted to the script she had rehearsed. It was a terrifying display of pure, unadulterated sociopathy. She was sitting in a puddle of her own vomit, surrounded by the ruins of her fake empire, and her only instinct was to execute the plan to destroy my life. She faked a dramatic, trembling gasp. She raised a shaking, frosting-covered finger and pointed it directly at me. "She is crazy!" Caroline wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent ballroom. "She attacked me! She drugged me!" "Mom, do you see what she did? You have to call the doctors right now. Call Dr. Evans. Get the conservatorship papers. She is completely unstable, and we need to take control of her estate before she hurts anyone else." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the ballroom. The sheer audacity of her lie, delivered while she looked like a deranged villain, left the remaining guests entirely speechless. They stared at her not with the sympathy she expected, but with absolute revulsion. Caroline looked around, finally noticing the cold, hard stares. She looked at Catherine, expecting our mother to rush to her side and coddle her as she always had. But Catherine did not move. Our mother just stared at her golden child, her face contorted with a mixture of hatred and profound regret. Mom, Caroline whined, her voice taking on that familiar, petulant tone she had used to manipulate our parents since childhood. "Did you not hear me? She drugged me. Call the ambulance. Get the papers. We have to finalize the medical hold tonight." I watched her perform, feeling a deep wave of disgust. This was the sister I had spent my entire life trying to appease. This was the woman who had stolen my college fund, hijacked my parents' love, and funded her vanity with stolen retirement money. And now, cornered and confused, she was still desperately trying to steal the one thing I had built for myself. She wanted to lock me in a psychiatric ward and strip away my freedom, all so she could buy more designer shoes and luxury vacations. "You really do not know when to quit, Caroline," I said, my voice cutting through the flashing red and blue lights like a blade. "You are so committed to the lie that you cannot even see the walls caving in around you." "I am not lying," she shrieked, struggling to stand, but her heels slipped again, sending her crashing back down into the cake. "You poisoned me. You belong in a hospital." I reached under the sweetheart table and retrieved a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the sealed bag was a single crystal champagne flute. The rim was still stained with a faint trace of lipstick, and a cloudy residue coated the bottom of the glass. I held the bag high in the air, letting the emergency lights catch the facets of the crystal. "I did not drink it, Caroline," I announced, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "I saw you hovering over my drink during the toasts. I swapped our glasses when you turned to smile for the photographer. You drank the very sedatives you brought to drug me. Caroline froze. Her mouth hung open in a silent, horrified "oh." Her eyes darted from the evidence bag in my hand to Elijah, then back to me. The fog in her brain was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a sharp, piercing panic. But I kept the glass. I continued stepping around the table and walking slowly toward her. I sealed it the moment you collapsed. The residue inside this glass, combined with the security footage Liam secured showing you dropping the pills into the champagne, is more than enough evidence to put you away for conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping. That is not true, Caroline stammered, scooting backward across the floor, leaving a trail of blue frosting behind her. You cannot prove anything. It was Elijah's idea. He bought the pills. He told me to do it. From the back of the room, Elijah let out a furious roar. His self-preservation instincts, already dialed to maximum, flared violently as his wife threw him under the bus in front of dozens of witnesses. "Shut your mouth, you stupid spoiled brat!" Elijah screamed, shoving his way past the catering staff and storming toward her. He looked at her with a blazing, unhinged fury that made several guests step in to block his path. "Do not try to pin this on me. You were the one complaining that you needed her money. You were the one who contacted the corrupt doctor. You orchestrated this entire circus because you could not stop spending money we did not have." "I did it for us," Caroline shrieked back at him, her voice cracking as she began to sob hysterically. "You told me the fund was failing. You told me my parents were broke. You said if we got control of Gwen's business, we could liquidate her assets and move to Monaco." The crowd gasped again. Caroline, in her panicked, drugged state, had just loudly confessed to the entire plot in front of half the Boston elite. She had completely incriminated both herself and her husband, confirming every single accusation I had made over the past hour. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at his wife, his mouth opening and closing as he realized she had just handed the authorities a verbal confession. He ran his hands over his head, pulling at his hair in absolute despair. "You idiot," he whispered, his voice trembling with defeat. "You absolute brainless idiot. You just gave them everything." I stood over her, looking down at the pathetic, ruined woman who had tormented me for 30 years. There was no victory lap needed. She had destroyed herself. "You always were your own worst enemy, Caroline," I said quietly. "And now you get to pay the price." The heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom suddenly burst open. A tactical team of federal agents dressed in dark windbreakers with large yellow letters printed across their backs flooded into the room. A tactical team of federal agents dressed in dark windbreakers with large yellow letters printed across their backs flooded into the room. They moved with terrifying military precision, immediately securing the perimeter and blocking every possible exit. The harsh static crackle of their two-way radios cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. The main hotel lights were suddenly flipped on, flooding the space with a glaring, sterile brightness that banished the romantic wedding ambiance and exposed the absolute ruin of my family in high definition. The lead agent, a tall woman with a sharp gaze and an unyielding posture, walked directly toward the sweetheart table. Liam stood by my side as I handed her the heavy forensic binder and the plastic evidence bag containing Caroline's poisoned champagne flute. She gave a curt professional nod, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto the sweating, hyperventilating figure of my brother-in-law. She signaled her team. 2 large agents flanked Elijah immediately. They grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with practiced force. The cold, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply across the marble floor. That definitive sound shattered the very last remnant of Elijah's sanity. He stopped pulling against the agents. His survival instinct, realizing he was entirely trapped, violently switched its target. He turned his head, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom, and locked his wild eyes on his wife. "This is all your fault," Elijah screamed, his voice tearing from his throat in a raw, animalistic roar. Caroline, still sitting in a messy puddle of blue frosting, and her own vomit, flinched violently. She stared up at him, her drug-fogged brain struggling to comprehend why her partner in crime was suddenly baring his teeth at her. "If you had just left your sister alone," Elijah yelled, struggling against the agent's grip, just to lean closer to her. If you had not hatched this idiotic, sloppy murder by conservatorship plot, she would have never looked into our accounts. You led a forensic accountant right to our front door. You brought the feds down on us because you were too jealous and too greedy to just leave well enough alone. Caroline scrambled backward, her hands slipping uselessly on the cake debris. I am the victim here, she shrieked, her voice pitched in a desperate, grating whine. I did not know anything. He lied to me about his money. I am just a wife. I did not do anything wrong. Elijah let out a harsh, barking laugh that bordered on manic. A passive wife, he spat out, his eyes blazing with a fury so intense it made the nearby guests physically recoil. You are the architect of this entire disaster. You knew about the Ponzi scheme from day one. You knew there were no actual investments. You sat in our penthouse and laughed about how easy it was to take money from these fools. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining crowd. Several high society investors, the very fools Elijah was referring to, turned pale with outrage. William slowly raised his head from his hands. His face was gray, deeply lined with an exhaustion that aged him 20 years in 20 minutes. Caroline. He rasped, his voice trembling with a terrifying fragility. Tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not know. Elijah did not even give her a chance to open her mouth. She is not lying, William. Elijah yelled, practically vibrating with spite. Who do you think gave me the financial records for your precious family estate? Caroline handed me the deeds. She told me you were desperate enough to fall for the 30% return lie. She told me exactly which buttons to push to make you hand over the $5 million. She engineered the theft of her own father's house. No, William choked out, gripping his chest as if he had been shot. Caroline shook her head frantically, smearing blue dye across her cheek. He was supposed to provide for me, she wailed, pointing an accusatory finger at her handcuffed husband. He is the man. He promised me a certain lifestyle. You demanded $50,000 a month just for your personal allowance, Elijah roared, drowning out her excuses. $50,000 a month minimum, Caroline. For designer clothes, daily spa treatments, and private jets to Monaco. When my legitimate trades could not cover your insane bottomless pit of a lifestyle, you told me to start faking the quarterly reports. You forced me to forge those documents to steal your father's money to pay for this fake elite life. You said your parents owed you because you were the only successful child they had. I stepped around the sweetheart table, my expression completely impassive as I looked down at the pathetic woman on the floor. The FBI already has the server logs, Caroline, I said, my voice echoing with icy, undeniable authority. You did not just spend the stolen money. You actively laundered it. You personally set up the shell companies in Cyprus. You authorized the wire transfers from the Chicago investor directly to your private jeweler. You were logged into the offshore accounts from your mobile phone while sitting at Mom's Thanksgiving dinner table last year. You are a co-conspirator in every single felony he committed. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. She looked down at Caroline with absolute professional disgust. Brianna. Caroline Blackwell, the agent announced, her voice booming across the silent ballroom. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted medical kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent. The reality of federal prison finally violently broke through the chemical haze of the sedatives Caroline had swallowed. She was not going to a luxury rehab facility. She was not going to charm her way out of this. Her golden child status, her designer labels, her country club prestige, absolutely none of it mattered to the federal agent stepping toward her. She was completely cornered. Her husband had sold her out to save himself. Her sister possessed the irrefutable hard evidence. Her father was staring at her with pure broken disgust. Desperate, terrified, and functioning on pure sociopathic self-preservation, Caroline frantically searched the room for a lifeline. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to absorb the blame. She locked eyes with the only person who had ever bailed her out of every mistake she had ever made. Catherine was standing frozen near the chairs, trembling violently, staring at her favorite daughter with a look of absolute uncomprehending horror. Caroline did not hesitate for a single second. She raised her shaking frosting-covered finger and pointed it directly at her own mother. "Do not blame me!" Caroline screamed, her voice cracking in pure desperation. "Mom made me do it!" Catherine recoiled as if she had been struck by lightning. The color completely drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and aged beneath the harsh glare of the emergency lights. She took a trembling step backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "Caroline." Catherine hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried perfectly in the dead silence of the room. "Shut your mouth right now. Do not say another word." But the dam had completely broken. The sedatives, the sheer terror of the federal agents closing in, and the realization that her husband had just served her up on a silver platter stripped away whatever loyalty Caroline had left. She scrambled onto her knees, her ruined designer gown pooling around her in a sticky mess of blue frosting. "I will not go to federal prison for you!" Caroline shrieked, pointing her shaking finger directly at our mother. "You are the one who told me I had to do whatever it took to maintain the lifestyle. You told me that if I ever embarrassed the family, if I ever let Gwendolyn look more successful than me, you would disown me completely. You threatened to cut me off if I did not play the part of the perfect wealthy daughter." Catherine lunged forward, her hands outstretched as if she was going to physically strangle her favorite daughter to keep her quiet. "You are hysterical!" Catherine yelled frantically, looking around at the federal agents who were now watching the exchange with professional, calculated interest. "She is drugged. She does not know what she is saying. Someone get a medic in here. She is hallucinating." "I know exactly what I am saying," Caroline sobbed, her voice rising to a frantic, ear-piercing pitch. "You knew exactly what Elijah was doing. You knew there was no real money left. When Dad's business started failing 3 years ago, you panicked. You came to my penthouse crying because you were going to lose your status at the country club. You told me Dad was completely bankrupt and that I needed to fix it. You told me to use Elijah's fund to keep our heads above water." William, who had been slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the floor, slowly lifted his head. His eyes locked onto his wife, a dawning horror spreading across his face. "You knew," William rasped, his voice barely audible over the sirens still wailing outside in the courtyard. Catherine froze, her back stiffening. She refused to look at him. She stared daggers at Caroline, silently begging her to stop, but the momentum was entirely out of her control. Caroline was spilling every dark, ugly secret they had kept hidden behind their manicured facade. "Of course she knew," Caroline wailed, wiping her nose with the back of her frosting-covered hand. "She told me to squeeze Elijah for more capital. She said we had to keep up appearances so nobody would know the family was broke." "Where do you think the money came from? For her facelifts, Dad. Where do you think the money came from for her charity galas and her luxury trips to Aspen? It came from me. It came from the money I told Elijah to pull from the new investors." I watched the absolute destruction of my mother's carefully curated universe. I looked past her and noticed something remarkable. The elite guests, the 200 high society friends, politicians, and corporate allies my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, were not looking away in polite discomfort. Instead, dozens of them had their phones out. The glowing screens illuminated the dark corners of the ballroom. They were recording everything. The prestigious social circle my mother had worshipped, the people she had relentlessly tried to prove she was better than, were currently live-streaming her complete degradation. They were capturing every tear, every accusation, and every dirty financial secret being screamed across the marble floor. Catherine saw it too. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from phone to phone, realizing that by tomorrow morning, this footage would be circulating through every country club boardroom and gossip column in Boston. Her reputation was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. She would be a social pariah, a laughingstock, an outcast in the very circles she had sacrificed her own daughter to remain a part of. "You forced me to siphon the funds," Caroline screamed, pounding her fists against the marble floor. "You told me to transfer the money out of Elijah's core accounts and hide it offshore. You said it was the only way to protect our image. You said Gwendolyn was just a pathetic cubicle worker and that I had to be the star. You made me do it to pay for your life. You told me Dad was too weak to handle the finances and that we had to take matters into our own hands. I looked at William. The man was practically vibrating. The pieces were finally locking into place in his mind. The terrifying clarity of what his family had done to him washed over his features. He had taken out a $5 million predatory loan against the generational estate, desperately trying to save himself from the bankruptcy Catherine apparently already knew about. He had handed that money to Elijah, believing it was a lifeline. And Elijah had immediately funneled it to Caroline, who was using it to secretly fund Catherine's lifestyle. They had cannibalized him. His own wife and his golden child had conspired to drain his last remaining asset, bleeding him dry, while smiling at him across the dinner table. They let him leverage the family home into absolute oblivion, just so Catherine could keep getting cosmetic surgery and Caroline could keep pretending to be a billionaire. They had played him for a complete fool. William let out a sound I had never heard before. It was a primal, guttural roar that tore from the very bottom of his chest. It was the sound of a man who had just realized his entire existence was a punchline. His legacy, his wealth, his pride, all of it stolen by the women he had favored over me his entire life. He did not lunge at Catherine. He did not lunge at Caroline. William turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward the man who had facilitated the entire con. He launched himself out of the chair, his heavy frame moving with a sudden terrifying speed, and lunged directly at Elijah. The impact sounded like a horrific car crash. William, fueled by decades of suppressed rage and the immediate staggering reality of complete financial ruin, hit his son-in-law with the force of a runaway freight train. Elijah, already terrified and completely off balance from the shocking revelations, did not even have the time to raise his hands to defend himself. The two men collided heavily and went airborne for a fraction of a second before slamming violently onto the polished marble floor. William did not hesitate for a single heartbeat. His large, heavy hands instantly clamped down around Elijah's tailored collar, sliding up to wrap firmly and unforgivingly around his throat. William squeezed with a murderous, terrifying intensity. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, the veins in his neck popping violently against his starched white collar. $5 million! William roared, leaning his entire body weight into the chokehold, his spit flying into Elijah's face. You stole my life, you stole my house, you took everything I built and handed it to these parasites. You bled me dry. Elijah gasped, a wet, terrible choking sound escaping his lips. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his sweating forehead. He thrashed wildly on the marble, his expensive Italian leather shoes kicking aimlessly against the floor, squeaking against the polished stone. He clawed frantically at William's wrists, his perfectly manicured nails desperately trying to pry the older man's thick fingers apart. But William possessed the adrenaline of a man who had just watched his entire legacy burn to ash in real time. He was completely unyielding. The illusion of high society sophistication that my family had fiercely protected for decades completely evaporated into thin air. Catherine let out a shrill, ear-piercing shriek. She threw herself into the melee, completely abandoning her designer heels and her pristine, calculated socialite persona. She launched herself at her husband, grabbing fistfuls of his expensive tuxedo jacket. She clawed at his shoulders, her acrylic nails digging viciously into his suit fabric. "William, stop it right now!" Catherine shrieked, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. "You are going to kill him, let him go. The police are already outside. Do you want to go to federal prison for murder? Stop making a scene. We are in public." Caroline remained on the floor just a few feet away from the violent thrashing scuffle. She was still heavily coated in the sticky blue frosting from my ruined wedding cake, smelling foul and looking completely unhinged. She pounded her fists against the ground, sobbing loudly, a wretched guttural noise that added to the feral symphony echoing across the ballroom. She cried for her lost penthouse, her lost jewelry, her lost status. She wept for her destroyed image. She did not cry for her father, who was currently committing felony assault, or her husband, who was rapidly turning purple on the dance floor. The circle of 200 elite guests, the very people Catherine and Caroline had sacrificed their souls and their finances to impress, scrambled backward in absolute terror. They bumped into tables, knocking over crystal champagne flutes and tall silver centerpieces. The sharp sound of shattering glass joined the chaotic noise of the brawl. Nobody stepped in to intervene. Nobody tried to pull William off the gasping fraud. The elite crowd simply held their cell phones higher, ensuring they captured every single second of the Blackwell family's descent into absolute barbarism. Liam placed a gentle, steadying hand on the small of my back, guiding me 2 steps backward. We moved completely out of the blast radius, stepping up onto the slightly elevated platform where the remains of the dessert station stood. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, settling deep into my bones. For my entire life, I had lived in terror of these people. I had tiptoed around Catherine's cruel judgments, shrunk myself to avoid Caroline's relentless bullying, and desperately chased William's elusive conditional approval. I had believed their wealth made them untouchable. I had believed their power over my life was absolute. I turned my head and noticed a young catering waiter pressing himself flat against the patterned wallpaper, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He was holding a silver serving tray like a protective shield. I offered him a polite, reassuring smile. "Excuse me," I said, my voice remarkably calm and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of my family destroying each other. "I know things are a bit chaotic right now, but would it be possible to get 2 slices from the bottom tier of the wedding cake? The part that Caroline did not manage to land on." The waiter blinked rapidly, entirely bewildered by my serene demeanor. He looked from the violent, animalistic brawl on the dance floor back to me. He swallowed hard, nodded frantically, and scrambled to grab 2 clean porcelain plates. He quickly sliced into the pristine white fondant of the bottom tier, plating 2 generous slices and handing them to Liam and me with trembling hands. "Thank you so much," I said, taking the plate. Liam and I stood side by side on the elevated platform, holding our dessert plates. I took a slow bite. It was a rich, dark chocolate truffle cake with a tart raspberry filling. It tasted absolutely incredible. We ate our cake in comfortable, shared silence, watching the people who had tortured me for 3 decades tear each other to shreds on the floor. William was still screaming about his stolen millions, his face twisted in a mask of pure grief and rage. Catherine was sobbing hysterically, her designer gown ruined, her social standing permanently pulverized. Caroline was wailing in a puddle of her own vomit, screaming about her lost allowance. Elijah was gasping for air, his fraudulent empire collapsing around his neck. It was the perfect visual metaphor for the end of the abuse. They were not powerful titans of industry. They were not untouchable socialites. They were just greedy, empty, pathetic people who had finally run out of victims to bleed dry. Stripped of my money and William's credit, they had turned their fangs on each other. The generational rot that had infected this family for decades was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality, and it was eating them alive. I chewed another bite of chocolate cake, feeling the very last invisible chains snapping off my wrists. I was free. I was finally, truly free. Then the violent sounds of the brawl, the shrieks, the shattering glass, and the frantic clicking of camera phones were suddenly violently interrupted. A massive booming impact reverberated through the entire luxury resort. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were kicked open with enough force to crack the plaster on the adjacent walls. Over a dozen tactical agents from the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division flooded into the room. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, their dark windbreakers rustling sharply as they fanned out to secure the perimeter and block every possible exit. "Federal agents, nobody move." The command echoed from a tall, broad-shouldered man at the front of the formation. His voice was a booming baritone that instantly neutralized the chaotic screaming, the shattering glass, and the frantic murmurs of the ballroom. William froze. His thick hands were still clamped tightly around his son-in-law's tailored collar, his knuckles white from the force of his murderous grip. The sheer shock of the armed intrusion pierced through his blinding rage. He slowly uncurled his fingers, stepping back and dropping Elijah like a discarded rag doll. Elijah hit the marble floor with a heavy, wet thud. He curled into a fetal position, coughing and gasping for air, his hands clutching his bruised and rapidly swelling throat. Catherine stopped her hysterical shrieking, shrinking back and covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Caroline remained completely paralyzed in her puddle of ruined wedding cake, her drug-fogged brain short-circuiting as she stared at the federal badges flashing under the ballroom lights. The lead agent did not look at William. He did not look at Catherine, who was trying to adjust her torn designer gown, or Caroline, who was actively weeping into the frosting. He completely ignored the 200 elite guests, the politicians, and the high society socialites who suddenly realized they were trapped in an active crime scene. Instead, the agent holstered his weapon and walked with calm, deliberate purpose straight across the dance floor. He stepped over overturned silver centerpieces and completely bypassed the brawling family heading directly toward the sweetheart table. Liam and I remained standing on the elevated platform. I took another slow bite of my raspberry chocolate cake, savoring the rich flavor as the agent approached. He stopped at the edge of the platform and offered a respectful professional nod. Gwendolyn, the lead agent, said, his voice entirely conversational and completely devoid of the aggression he had used moments ago. "We got your transmission. The offshore accounts are frozen." I offered him a polite, genuine smile, setting my fork down on the porcelain plate. "Right on time, Agent Reynolds." The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom was so loud, it sounded like the air had been violently sucked from the room. My family stared at me, their faces contorted into masks of absolute uncomprehending horror. The realization hit them like a physical blow. I was not just a victim who had finally snapped. I had not just stumbled upon Elijah's financial records and thrown a lucky punch out of spite. I was a high-level asset. I had orchestrated this entire sting operation, and I had executed it with a ruthless, flawless precision designed to align perfectly with my wedding day. William stared at me, his chest heaving, his face ashen. "Gwendolyn." He rasped, his voice breaking under the weight of his own profound ignorance. "What did you do?" "I did my job, William," I replied smoothly, stepping off the platform to stand eye to eye with the man who had ignored my existence for 30 years. "I am a senior forensic accountant. When you allowed Elijah to handle the family trust, you gave a desperate con artist the keys to the castle. But Elijah is sloppy. 6 months ago, I noticed the glaring discrepancies in your quarterly statements. I flagged the ghost accounts in the Cayman Islands and the illicit wire transfers routing through Cyprus. I looked down at Caroline, who was shivering uncontrollably, her fake eyelashes peeling off her face, and I noticed the massive monthly withdrawals funneling directly into Caroline's private accounts. $50,000 a month leaves a massive digital footprint when it is spent on Cartier bracelets and unauthorized Botox. So I took my findings to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Agent Reynolds and I have been building this federal case for half a year. Catherine stumbled forward, her face flushed with indignant rage. Her pathological need to maintain control overrode her fear of the armed agents surrounding her. "You brought the FBI to your own wedding," she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "You ruined your own reception just to humiliate your sister." "I did not ruin anything, Catherine," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "I chose this venue specifically because it had an isolated, secure network architecture. Liam and I designed the cybersecurity layout for this exact moment. I needed all of you in one room. I needed Elijah's entire network of corrupt politicians and elite investors trapped in a single confined space while the feds mirrored his servers." I gestured toward the crowd of wealthy socialites. Arthur, the real estate mogul, was frantically trying to delete files from his phone, only to have an agent swiftly snatch the device from his hands. Every single person in this room who received a fraudulent dividend from Elijah's Ponzi scheme is now part of an active federal investigation. The transmission Liam sent 12 minutes ago gave the FBI complete administrative access to the entire financial ledger. Elijah, still on his hands and knees, looked up at me. His arrogant, untouchable facade was entirely eradicated. His face was purple and bruised from William's attack, his expensive tuxedo ripped at the shoulder. He looked like a cornered rat, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. "You set me up!" Elijah gasped, his voice raspy and broken as he clutched his throat. You let me stand up there and make that toast. You let me think I had won. You played yourself, Elijah, I replied, crossing my arms and looking down at him with unadulterated apathy. You were so convinced that I was just the invisible, unremarkable sister. You were so busy trying to steal my college fund and impress my greedy mother that you never stopped to consider that I actually build the security systems you were trying to hack. You underestimated me because Catherine and Caroline taught you to. Catherine let out a strangled, breathless sob, finally realizing the absolute finality of the situation. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no PR firm expensive enough to erase a live-streamed federal raid. Her prestigious country club memberships were gone. Her luxury vacations were gone. Her entire identity built on stolen money and generational greed had been completely eradicated by the very daughter she had deemed socially unfit. Please, Catherine begged, holding her trembling hands out to Agent Reynolds. We did not know the extent of it. My husband is the victim here. Elijah stole from us. We are innocent. Agent Reynolds did not even acknowledge her presence. He adjusted his dark windbreaker, his eyes locked entirely on the bruised and battered man kneeling on the marble floor. The ballroom held its breath as the heavy metallic clinking of steel echoed in the deafening silence. Agent Reynolds towered over the pathetic, whimpering form of Elijah. The titan of finance was reduced to a bruised, bleeding mess on the marble floor. Reynolds did not offer a hand or a shred of human sympathy. She simply nodded to the two massive tactical agents flanking him. They grabbed Elijah by the armpits and violently hauled him to his feet. His custom Italian tuxedo jacket tore further at the seam, the sharp sound ripping through the dead, silent ballroom. Elijah groaned loudly as his weight shifted onto his trembling legs. He tried to straighten his posture, desperately attempting to summon whatever shreds of authority he had left, but the cold steel biting into his wrists made it completely impossible. Elijah Vance, Agent Reynolds, began, her voice ringing out with absolute chilling clarity. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I need a deal, Elijah blurted out, a panicked sob tearing from his throat. He completely ignored his Miranda rights, his terror overriding any legal sense he possessed. His eyes darted wildly between Reynolds and the sea of guests, recording his downfall on their phones. He leaned toward the federal agent, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper. I can give you names. I can give you the offshore account managers in the Caymans. I know the local politicians who took a cut to look the other way on the real estate zoning laws. I can hand you the entire network on a silver platter. Just give me immunity. I will turn state's evidence tonight. Reynolds stopped reading the rights. She stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then a low, humorless laugh escaped her lips. The sound was entirely devoid of warmth. She shook her head slowly, looking at Elijah as if he were a particularly repulsive insect. She raised her hand and gestured toward me. We do not need you, Mr. Vance Reynolds stated flatly. Your sister-in-law already gave us everything. Elijah's head whipped toward me, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer disbelief. I stepped forward, smoothing the front of my wedding dress. I did not break eye contact. I mapped the entire network 3 months ago, Elijah. I traced the wire transfers from your dummy corporation straight into the campaign funds of the state senator you thought was protecting you. I handed the IRS the decryption keys to your hidden servers on Tuesday. We do not need a confession from you because we already have the digital footprint of every single illegal transaction you have made for the last 5 years. We have the partitioned hard drives, the offshore routing numbers, and the fake quarterly reports you forged. You have zero leverage. You have absolutely nothing left to trade. Elijah's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. The absolute finality of his situation crashed down on his shoulders. There would be no plea deal. There would be no reduced sentence. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his wealth and his power. His knees gave out entirely, but the two tactical agents held him firmly upright, their grips like iron vices on his biceps. "Get him out of here," Reynolds ordered, turning her back on him completely. The agents dragged Elijah forward. He stumbled, his feet slipping on the polished marble, as they marched him straight through the center of the ballroom. The crowd of elite guests, the very people he had scammed, manipulated, and desperately tried to impress, parted like the Red Sea. They did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. They offered their smartphone cameras. Dozens of camera flashes erupted, illuminating Elijah's bruised, tear-stained face. The guests live streamed his perp walk, documenting his absolute humiliation for the entire world to see. People he had golfed with actively jeered at him. Arthur, the real estate mogul, stood at the front of the crowd, recording the scene with a look of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Women who had kissed Elijah's cheek an hour ago now stared at him with visceral disgust. The golden boy of Boston finance was being paraded through his own fraudulent kingdom in handcuffs, publicly butchered by the very society he had worshipped. He kept his head down, sobbing audibly, as the heavy oak doors closed behind him, sealing his fate. With Elijah gone, the crushing reality of the situation fell squarely onto the remaining conspirators. The ballroom was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the tactical agents securing the perimeter. I stood near the sweetheart table, watching the oak doors swing shut. The profound sense of closure was intoxicating. I turned my attention back to the dance floor where the wreckage of my family remained. William was still on his knees, gasping for air, clutching his chest, as he stared blankly at the spot where his $5 million had just been hauled away in handcuffs. Catherine was backed against a pillar, her face buried in her hands, weeping as she realized her country club life was officially over. But Caroline was still sitting in the ruins of the 4-tier wedding cake. The reality of her impending arrest had finally burned through the chemical haze of the sedatives. She watched Elijah being dragged away, and the absolute terror of federal prison completely broke her mind. She was not equipped for consequences. She had spent her entire 30 years being shielded from accountability by my parents. Now there was no one left to shield her. Her husband had thrown her under the bus. Her father was utterly broken. Her mother was paralyzed by public shame. Caroline looked around the room, her eyes wide and feral. She looked at the federal agents who were now moving methodically toward her, holding a pair of steel handcuffs. Panic consumed her completely. She locked eyes with me. She saw me standing there on the elevated platform, calm, collected, and entirely in control of the destruction raining down on her head. Caroline did not stand up. She did not attempt to maintain her dignity. She dropped onto her hands and knees, her expensive designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne and blue frosting smeared across the marble. She began to crawl. She scrambled across the dance floor, her movements jerky and desperate. She ignored the disgusted gasps of the guests as she dragged her vomit-stained dress across the pristine stone. She crawled directly toward the sweetheart table, her eyes fixed entirely on me, leaving a thick trail of ruin in her wake. She reached the edge of the elevated platform where Liam and I were standing. She lunged forward, her shaking, frosting-covered fingers stretching out with terrifying desperation. She grabbed the pristine white hem of my wedding dress, clutching the delicate silk fabric in her filthy hands. "Gwen, please," Caroline wailed, her voice, a wretched ear-splitting shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. "I am your sister. You have to help me. You have the money. You have to pay my bail. You have to save me." I looked down at the woman who had spent decades convinced that the world revolved around her fragile, manufactured needs. Caroline was still kneeling in the sticky, congealing mess of the wedding cake, her fingers clawing at the fine silk of my dress like a desperate animal. She was sobbing, her makeup running in dark, jagged rivers down her face, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. She looked less like the high society icon she pretended to be, and more like the spoiled, petulant child she had never outgrown. I reached down and pried her fingers off my hem one by one. I did it with a steady, clinical detachment, the same way I might remove a stray thread from a garment. When I stood back, the silk of my dress was stained with blue frosting, but I didn't care. That dress was already a relic of a life I had officially left behind. "Save you," I repeated, my voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent room. The elite guests had gone completely still, their phones forgotten as they watched the final act of the Blackwell family collapse. You didn't just want me to save you, Caroline. You wanted to finish what you started 3 months ago. I turned my head toward Agent Reynolds, who was watching the scene with a cold professional interest. Agent Reynolds, I'd like to formally press charges against Caroline Blackwell for attempted poisoning and conspiracy to commit fraud. I have the medical records from the toxicology screening after my rehearsal dinner and the correspondence between Caroline and the supplier she hired to sabotage my food. Caroline let out a sound that was half scream, half gurgle. She scrambled backward, her hands flailing in the air as if she were trying to swat away the invisible weight of the charges. "No, that is not true," she wailed, her voice cracking. "That was a joke. I was just trying to teach you a lesson. You were always too sensitive." The lead agent did not look amused. He signaled to two female officers standing near the edge of the dance floor. They stepped forward, their movements crisp and authoritative. They didn't even give Caroline a chance to stand. They pinned her arms behind her back, the metallic snap of the handcuffs echoing sharply in the cavernous room. Caroline began to shriek a high, piercing sound that set my teeth on edge. She thrashed against the officers, her heels kicking up more cake and dirt. "This is a mistake. You cannot do this. Do you know who my father is? My father will ruin every single one of you." I watched as they hauled her toward the doors, her ruined designer gown trailing behind her like a shroud. She was being arrested in the same dress she had spent $40,000 on just 2 weeks ago, and now it was a garment of shame. She was being stripped of the power she had used to abuse me, to diminish me, to make me feel small for my entire adult life. She was stripped of everything except her own loud, wretched entitlement. I felt a ghost of a smile grace my lips. It was the ultimate poetic justice. She had always viewed life as a series of social moves on a chessboard, and she had just been decisively checkmated by the sister she hadn't bothered to learn how to play against. I didn't turn to look at my mother, but I could hear her. Catherine had collapsed onto the marble floor, her posture shattered, her carefully maintained veneer completely dissolved. She was rocking back and forth on her heels, her hands clawing at her hair as if she could physically pull her past back into existence. "Please, Gwen." Catherine sobbed, the sound raw and desperate. "Please, she is your sister. She is your blood. Don't let them take my golden child. Think of what this will do to us. Think of our family name." I felt no surge of triumph, only a cold, hard sense of inevitability. I walked over to where Catherine was spiraling, her world vanishing into a federal indictment. I stood over her, my shadow falling across her face. "Your family name died the second you decided to trade your integrity for a fake lifestyle, Catherine," I said. "I am not the one who let them take her. You did. You built her on a foundation of lies and entitlement, and you told her she was untouchable. You made her this way." Catherine looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and swollen, her face hollowed by the sudden terrifying weight of her future. She reached out to grab my hand, to beg, to plead, but I took a step back, refusing to offer her the anchor she was looking for. "William, say something," Catherine shrieked, looking toward the corner where my father was slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on nothing. Tell her this is all a lie." My father didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He was a man who had finally realized that the two most important women in his life had been systematically siphoning his future to pay for their own vanity. He looked at me, then at Catherine, and then at the tactical agents surrounding the room. For the first time, he looked like what he was, an old, tired man who had lost everything he had ever cared about. The agents were methodical. They moved through the room, seizing laptops, hard drives, and private phones. The gala was effectively a closed containment zone. Anyone who had collaborated with Elijah was being identified, photographed, and processed. The 200 high society friends, the corporate allies, the people my mother had spent decades curating relationships with, they were all being led toward the side exits to be questioned, to be checked, to be integrated into the federal investigation. The ballroom was beginning to empty, leaving behind only the wreckage of the Blackwell family. It was quiet now, the frantic energy of the raid replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the aftermath. Agent Reynolds walked back to my side. He stood beside me, surveying the scene of the total collapse. "We have the evidence we need, Gwen," he said quietly. "Your documentation was impeccable. The offshore servers have been mirrored and the wire transfers have all been traced to the original source accounts. You did the work of a dozen agents." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of exhaustion finally creeping in. "What happens to them now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They are being processed at the Central Holding Facility," Reynolds replied. "They will have their day in court, but given the sheer volume of fraudulent documentation and the scale of the money laundering, they aren't going to be seeing the outside world for a very long time." I turned away from the scene and looked at Liam. He had remained silent and steady throughout the entire ordeal, his presence an island of calm in the middle of the storm. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and grounding. "I think we're done here," he said. I looked at my mother one last time. She was still sitting on the floor, staring at the empty dance floor, the woman who had spent my entire life telling me that I was never enough, finally realizing that she, in fact, was nothing at all. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer a final word of comfort. I simply turned and walked toward the exit, my wedding dress dragging behind me, my new life waiting on the other side of the doors. I took exactly 3 steps toward the heavy oak doors before a frantic scrambling noise echoed behind me. William and Catherine had finally shaken off their paralysis. They lunged across the ruined marble dance floor, cutting off my path to the exit. William stood firmly in front of the double doors, his chest heaving. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled, stained with sweat, and completely stripped of the imposing authority it usually carried. Catherine was right beside him. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines, and her ruined designer gown hung off her like a cheap rag. The sheer blinding arrogance that had fueled their entire existence was now entirely replaced by naked, pathetic desperation. William's eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the few remaining federal agents securing evidence boxes. Then he looked directly at me. He did not look at me with newfound respect. He did not look at me with the remorse of a father who realized he had horribly wronged his daughter. He looked at me exactly the way he used to look at Elijah. He looked at me like a bank vault. "Gwendolyn, wait," William gasped, throwing his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. "You cannot just walk away. You cannot just leave us here like this." I stopped, folding my hands together calmly. Liam stepped up right beside me, a silent, immovable wall of support. "I am walking out of my wedding reception, William. I suggest you contact a very good bankruptcy lawyer. There is nothing left for me to say." "You have millions!" William practically shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous, emptying ballroom. "Elijah said it himself before the raid. You own the cybersecurity firm. You own this entire resort. You have the capital to fix this mess right now." He took a desperate, heavy step forward, his hands trembling as he pointed a thick finger at my chest. "You have to pay off the bank, Gwendolyn. You have to save the estate." I leveraged everything we had. If the feds freeze Elijah's assets, the bank is going to foreclose on the Beacon Hill house by Monday morning. We will be entirely wiped out. I need $5 million wired to my personal account by tomorrow, or we lose the property. You have to write a check right now." Before I could even process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand, Catherine pushed past him. She grabbed my forearm with her acrylic nails digging into my skin. "And Caroline." Catherine wept, her voice a shrill, grating whine that grated against my eardrums. "Your sister is in federal custody. Do you have any idea how much a high-profile criminal defense attorney costs? You have to pay her bail, Gwen. You have to fund her legal team. She will not survive a single day in a federal prison. She is delicate. You have to save her." I looked down at Catherine's hand, gripping my arm. My expression was entirely devoid of pity. I did not feel a single ounce of familial obligation. I did not feel the crushing guilt that had kept me obedient for the first 20 years of my life. I felt nothing but absolute freezing clarity. I pulled my arm away with a sharp, deliberate motion, forcing Catherine to stumble backward. "Save her?" I asked, leaning in close so she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "You want me to pay the legal fees for the woman who literally tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward so she could steal the company I bled to build? You want me to bail out the sister who attempted to poison me tonight? I just pressed federal charges against her, Catherine. I am not funding her defense. I am not. I turned my gaze to William, who was practically vibrating with panicked rage. And as for your estate, William, why on earth would I pay $5 million to save a house I was never welcome in? You mortgaged your own legacy to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. You handed your money to a con artist because you were too lazy to read a financial statement. That is your mess. You can clean it up. We are your parents! William roared, the veins in his neck bulging as his face flushed a dangerous, violent crimson. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We paid for your food and your clothes. You owe us, Gwendolyn. You owe this family. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. You gave me the absolute bare minimum required by law to keep Child Protective Services off your doorstep. You gave Caroline the world, and you handed me her discarded leftovers. You paid for her luxury cars, her designer bags, and her fake penthouse while I worked 3 jobs to pay for my own college tuition. I do not owe you a single dime. I paid off my debt to this family every single day of my childhood by serving as your emotional punching bag. Catherine fell to her knees, her ruined dress pooling around her. She clasped her hands together, sobbing uncontrollably. Please, Gwen. We made mistakes. We were stressed, but we are blood. You cannot let your own mother end up homeless on the street. It will destroy our social standing. The country club will ban us. What will people say? I looked down at her, marveling at how completely disconnected from reality she truly was. Her favorite daughter was facing 20 years for wire fraud, her husband was utterly bankrupt, and she was crying about her country club membership. They will say Catherine Blackwell finally got exactly what she deserved, I said smoothly. They will say, you backed the wrong horse. William took another aggressive step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. He looked like he was about to physically tackle me to the floor to extort the money. You listen to me, you ungrateful little. I did not even flinch. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers twice, signaling to the resort security guards stationed near the exits. 2 massive, broad-shouldered security guards immediately stepped up behind William and Catherine, their expressions stoic and intimidating. They crossed their arms easily, towering over my furious father and weeping mother. I stared at my parents, my eyes ice cold. The 2 massive resort security guards stood firmly behind them, their faces completely impassive, waiting for my signal. William puffed up his chest, an automatic muscle memory reaction to being challenged. He tried to summon the commanding aristocratic presence that had terrorized me throughout my childhood. He glared at the guard to his left, his face a mask of manufactured outrage. Take your hands off me! William barked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. I am William Blackwell. You work for me. The guard did not even blink. He did not loosen his grip. He simply kept his eyes fixed directly on me, waiting for my command. They do not work for you, William, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom. Nobody works for you anymore. You do not own this resort. You do not own the ground you are standing on. I do. And right now you are trespassing. Catherine let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, trying to bridge the physical gap between us. Gwen, please. She sobbed, tears cutting deep tracks through her thick layer of expensive foundation. You cannot do this. You are our daughter. We gave you life. We are family. You have to help us. I did not move a single inch. I looked at the woman who had spent decades treating me like an embarrassing stain on her perfect social record. I looked at the man who had just demanded $5 million from me with the same casual arrogance he used to order a cocktail. I don't owe you anything. I stated, my words falling like heavy stones onto the ruined marble floor. My empathy for you died the day I was 18, staring at a bank statement with a 0 balance while you packed Caroline's bags for Paris. Catherine flinched, as if I had physically struck her. William's jaw tightened, his eyes darting away for a fraction of a second. I remembered that day with absolute crystal clarity. I remembered sitting in my tiny, unheated bedroom, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. I had worked 3 part-time jobs for 2 years to save exactly $6,000 for my community college tuition. I had scrubbed floors, answered phones, and served coffee to people just like them. And on the morning my tuition was due, the money was gone. William had quietly transferred every single cent out of my account to cover the excess baggage fees and the first-class upgrade for Caroline's summer trip to Europe. When I confronted him, he told me I was being selfish. He told me Caroline needed the cultural exposure for her future, and that my little community college classes could wait. You stole my future to fund her vacation, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. You drained my savings so your golden child could drink champagne under the Eiffel Tower, and you told me I was ungrateful for crying about it. You gambled your house on a fraud, and you lost. Being blood doesn't give you the right to be a parasite. William's face turned a violent shade of purple. He lunged forward, but the security guard instantly yanked him back, pinning his arms firmly behind his back. The sudden forceful movement made William grunt in pain, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping slightly at the shoulder. You are a dropout, William roared, completely losing his mind. You are a college dropout who got lucky. You owe your entire existence to us. We shaped you. We pushed you. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that carried zero warmth. You loved calling me that, didn't you? I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. For 10 years, you made sure every single person in your social circle knew I was the family disappointment, the college dropout. You wore that word like a badge of honor at your country club dinners. You used my supposed failure to make Caroline look brighter. You told your wealthy friends that I threw my life away, that I was a lost cause, that I lacked the discipline to succeed. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into his panicking brain. But you never understood what I actually dropped out of, William. I did not just drop out of a university. I dropped out of your toxic parasitic family. I dropped out of your fake reality. Cutting you off completely was the exact catalyst I needed. It was the only way I could breathe. It was the only way I could focus on my code, build my company, and actually become a millionaire. Escaping your daily abuse is what made me rich. I am standing here today, holding the deed to this property and the keys to your destruction precisely because I dropped out of being your victim. Catherine dropped her face into her hands, wailing loudly. The sound was pitiful, a wretched noise of a woman mourning the death of her illusions. She fell forward, her knees hitting the hard stone floor. Gwen? I am sorry, Catherine shrieked, her voice muffled by her hands. I will change. We will be a real family. I will be the mother you always wanted. Just write the check. Just save the house. I cannot be poor, Gwen. I cannot live like normal people. Please. You do not want a daughter, Catherine, I said, looking down at her weeping form with total emotional detachment. You want an ATM, and my services are permanently denied. I looked up at the two security guards. The time for talking was officially over. The final strings tying me to the Blackwell name had been severed, burned, and scattered to the wind. Escort these trespassers off my property, I ordered, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. If they resist, call the local police and have them arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Yes, ma'am, the lead guard replied instantly. He hauled William backward by the collar of his ruined tuxedo. William thrashed wildly, his polished leather shoes slipping on the champagne-soaked marble. He kicked and cursed, his face twisted in a mask of pure primal rage. You cannot do this to me, William screamed, his voice cracking violently. I am your father. I gave you your name. You will burn in hell for this, Gwendolyn. You will burn. The second guard reached down and hauled Catherine to her feet. She went entirely limp, forcing the massive guard to drag her dead weight across the floor. Her designer gown acted like a mop, soaking up the smeared blue frosting and spilled wine as she was pulled backward. She reached her hands out toward me, her fingers grasping at the empty air, sobbing my name over and over again in a relentless, agonizing loop. The few remaining elite guests watched in absolute stunned silence. The people who had once kissed Catherine's cheeks and shaken William's hand now pressed themselves against the walls, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Blackwell family. They watched as the former king and queen of Boston high society were physically dragged out of a ballroom like common criminals. William continued to scream curses, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, growing fainter as the guards hauled them through the grand foyer. Catherine's wailing dissolved into breathless, hysterical hiccups. They were pulled across the threshold. The guard stepped back inside. The heavy, solid oak double doors swung shut with a massive, echoing thud. The sound resonated through the ballroom like the final strike of a gavel. The lock clicked into place. The storm was over. The toxic, suffocating presence of my parents was permanently removed from my atmosphere. The ballroom was completely silent. The air was still heavy with the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. The federal agents had finished boxing up their evidence. The shattered remnants of the four-tier wedding cake lay smeared across the center of the dance floor. I took a deep, steadying breath. I felt Liam step close to my side, his hand resting gently on the small of my back, a silent promise that he was entirely with me. I placed my hand over his, drawing strength from his calm, unwavering presence. I smoothed the front of my pristine silk wedding dress. I rolled my shoulders back, standing taller than I ever had in my entire life. I slowly turned around to face my remaining guests. The room was no longer packed with Boston's elite snobs. The 200 socialites, the fraudulent business partners, and the fake friends who had spent the evening gossiping behind their hands had all been swept out the side exits by the federal agents. The cavernous ballroom, which had felt so suffocating just moments ago, suddenly felt incredibly intimate. The people standing before me were the ones who actually mattered. Liam's parents stood at the front of the crowd. His mother was wiping a tear from her cheek. Not tears of horror or public shame, but tears of profound relief and fierce pride. Next to her stood my entire cybersecurity team, the brilliant engineers and analysts who had worked late nights alongside me, tracing offshore accounts and securing my empire. My college roommate, who had watched me survive on instant noodles while my sister vacationed in Paris, was grinning so hard her face looked like it might split in two. The toxic waste had been comprehensively flushed out, leaving only a solid foundation of pure, unadulterated support. The intense, vibrating energy that had fueled me through the last hour of confrontation suddenly evaporated. With the threat gone, my shoulders dropped. A heavy, sudden exhaustion washed over my limbs. It was the physical aftermath of shedding a lifetime of defensive armor, the heavy weight of anticipating their next cruel move finally dropping off my back. I swayed slightly on my heels, the reality of my absolute freedom crashing into my nervous system like a tidal wave. Before my knees could even think about buckling, Liam was right there. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was. He wrapped his strong arms securely around my waist and pulled me flush against his solid chest, anchoring me firmly to the present moment. He buried his hand in my hair, tilting my face up to meet his. His mouth met mine in a kiss that erased the rest of the world. It was deep, grounding, and fiercely protective. It tasted like a promise of safety. All the bitter words, the frantic shouting, and the ugly desperation of my parents melted away into the undeniable warmth of his touch. He held me as if I were the most precious thing he had ever possessed, completely indifferent to the chaos that had just unfolded. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with my own. "You did it," he whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated against my skin. "You are completely free of them. They will never touch you again." I nodded, leaning into his strength for just a fraction of a second longer, before turning my attention back to the room. While Liam and I had shared our private moment of victory, the resort staff had moved into action with military precision. My general manager, a woman I had personally hired for her absolute ruthlessness and efficiency, had quietly directed a team of custodians and servers onto the dance floor. In a matter of minutes, the sticky wreckage of Caroline's ruined cake was swept away into large bins. The champagne stains were mopped from the pristine white marble until it gleamed under the lights. The overturned chairs were righted, and the elegant, sophisticated ambiance of the ballroom was perfectly restored. They were my employees, my loyal people, and they cleared away the physical mess just as efficiently as I had cleared away the emotional one. The general manager caught my eye and gave a small, respectful nod, handing a silver microphone to the band leader, who quickly brought it down to me. I took the microphone, the cool metal grounding my hands. I looked out at the smiling faces of my true family. The silence in the room was no longer shocked, tense, or oppressive. It was expectant. It was incredibly warm. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs without a single ounce of restriction or anxiety. I apologize for the interruption, I said, my voice ringing out, clear, steady, and full of unburdened joy. But I am a firm believer in taking out the trash before starting a new chapter. A ripple of genuine, heartfelt laughter swept through the remaining crowd. I smiled, the expression reaching my eyes and crinkling the corners for the first time that evening. Now I believe we have a wedding to celebrate. The crowd erupted in response. It was not the polite, reserved golf clap applause of high society trying to maintain appearances. It was thunderous, authentic, roof-raising cheering. My lead engineer let out a piercing, celebratory whistle that echoed off the high ceiling. Liam's mother was openly crying, happy tears, clapping her hands together with unbridled joy, while his father pulled her into a joyous hug. At my cue, the conductor raised his baton, and the orchestra struck the first grand chord. It was not a slow, melancholic ballad. It was a triumphant, swelling symphony of brass and strings that filled the massive room with vibrant, undeniable life. Liam gently took the microphone from my hand, handed it off to a passing waiter, and swept me onto the center of the freshly cleaned marble floor. We moved together in absolute perfect synchronicity. The heavy silk of my wedding dress spun around my legs, the blue frosting stains hidden within the voluminous folds, serving as a secret, permanent battle scar of my ultimate victory. I looked up into Liam's bright eyes, seeing nothing but absolute adoration and a shared, limitless future stretching out before us. We spun across the floor, surrounded by the cheers of our friends, the bright laughter of his family, and the brilliant, warm glow of the crystal chandeliers overhead. I was not the forgotten middle child anymore. I was not the family scapegoat, the convenient bankroll, or the bitter disappointment. I was Gwendolyn Blackwell, a self-made woman, a fiercely loved wife, and the absolute master of my own universe. There were no more shadows lurking in the corners of my life, no more heavy obligations to toxic people who only saw my worth in dollar signs and social leverage. We danced through the entire song, completely lost in the magic of the moment, celebrating the absolute destruction of my past and the brilliant, untethered dawn of my future. The music swelled to a final, glorious crescendo, and Liam dipped me low, kissing me again, to the roaring, ecstatic approval of the room. The celebration raged on into the early hours of the morning, a flawless, joyful blur of dancing, heartfelt toasts and genuine love. It was the perfect wedding night, a seamless transition from darkness into bright, blinding light, slowly fading to black as the heavy doors to our private penthouse suite finally closed. We sealed away the noise of the outside world, leaving only the quiet, beautiful reality of our new life together. A life that was about to jump forward into a triumphant future I had built entirely with my own two hands. 1 year later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, casting a warm golden glow across the polished mahogany desk. I stood with my hands resting in my pockets, looking down at the bustling streets of Boston far below. The city looked entirely different from this height. It looked like a grid of endless possibilities, completely devoid of the suffocating shadows that had once haunted my every step. The hum of the morning traffic was a distant, soothing rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of my past. I took a deep, grounding breath, savoring the crisp scent of success and absolute autonomy. Behind me, the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall played the local morning news on low volume. I usually kept it tuned to the financial networks to monitor the global markets, but today was a special occasion. Today was the season finale of the disaster I had walked away from exactly 12 months ago. I turned my attention to the screen just as the anchor changed her expression to that practiced look of serious, grim reporting. Breaking news this morning from the federal courthouse, the anchor announced, her crisp voice filling the quiet office. Boston financier Elijah Vance has officially been sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Vance, once considered a rising star in the local real estate and tech sectors, was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The screen flashed a courtroom sketch of Elijah. He looked gaunt, completely stripped of his custom Italian suits and his unearned arrogance. His posture was slumped, a defeated man who had finally run out of other people's money to steal. The anchor continued, her tone steady. In a related sentencing, his wife Caroline Blackwell Vance received a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility for her role in the conspiracy and attempted fraud. The broadcast cut to a brief, shaky video clip recorded outside the courthouse steps. The camera focused on two figures trying to shield their faces from the aggressive flashes of the paparazzi. It was William and Catherine. I almost did not recognize them. The transformation was staggering. William was hunched over, leaning heavily on a cane, his expensive tailored coats replaced by a faded, ill-fitting jacket. He looked incredibly fragile, a hollow shell of the imposing patriarch he had always pretended to be. Catherine looked completely destroyed. The perfectly coiffed hair, the expensive jewelry, and the layers of high-end makeup were gone. She looked like a frail, terrified woman, clutching a cheap plastic handbag, shrinking away from the very public spotlight she used to relentlessly crave. They looked aged, miserable, and utterly broken by the weight of their own consequences. The anchor provided the final, brutal details of their downfall. The Blackwell estate, seized by the bank months ago, was recently auctioned off to satisfy creditors. Sources close to the family confirm the couple is now residing in a modest, low-income apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, their assets completely liquidated. I picked up the remote and clicked the television off. The screen faded to black, perfectly matching the absolute finality I felt in my chest. I did not feel a single shred of guilt. I did not feel a pang of sorrow for the parents who had gladly traded my well-being for their vanity. I felt nothing but a profound, untouchable peace. The poetic justice of Catherine Blackwell, a woman who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at the working class, being forced to live in a cramped, low-income apartment, was the perfect closing note to their fraudulent symphony. The soft click of the office door opening drew my attention away from the blank screen. Liam walked in, balancing 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He was dressed in a sharp-tailored navy suit, looking every bit the formidable partner I had married. His eyes found mine, immediately assessing my mood, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "I saw the news playing in the lobby," Liam said, crossing the room and handing me my coffee. "How are you feeling about it?" I took a sip of the rich, dark roast and leaned against the edge of my desk. "I feel like a very long, very exhausting chapter has finally been permanently closed," I replied. Liam wrapped his free arm around my waist and pulled me close, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. We turned to look out the window together, surveying the skyline we had effectively conquered. The past year had been nothing short of explosive. Without the constant draining weight of my family dragging me down, my cybersecurity firm had expanded exponentially. We had secured major international contracts, acquired 2 smaller tech startups, and tripled our revenue. The coastal resort was thriving, booked solid for the next 3 years. I had not just protected the wealth I had bled to build, I had aggressively multiplied it. I was living a life of absolute peace, unburdened by toxic guilt, and entirely free from the parasitic demands of people who only saw me as a resource to be exploited. I rested my head against Liam's shoulder, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. We were partners in every sense of the word, building an empire on a foundation of mutual respect and unbreakable trust. There were no hidden agendas in my life anymore. There were no manipulative phone calls, no passive-aggressive dinner parties, no looming threats of sabotage. I had surgically removed the poison from my life, and the resulting growth was extraordinary. I looked at my reflection in the glass window, seeing a strong, fiercely independent woman who had walked through fire and come out holding the matches. The toxic illusion of the Blackwell family legacy was dead and buried, but my legacy was just beginning. I took another sip of my coffee, turning my back on the television and facing the bright, unwritten future. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes cutting off a cancerous tumor disguised as family is the only way to truly live. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace from the people who were supposed to love you most?